question. Okay. If I leave
No,
Anchorage,
we're done.
Alaska, and the ground speed is 300 mile per hour, and I'm flying toward the equator where the ground speed is 1,000 mile per hour, how does the plane pick up the additional ground speed to catch up with the Earth?
All right. Welcome, everybody. So today I'm going to continue my review of the discussions that have taken place on Jose JG's show about Coriolis. There's been quite a few people involved. In the last video, I took a look at George and what he had to say specifically about his analogy with the bug on a stick. And today we're going to review the discussions that have been had between Chris Berry, myself, and BlueMarbleScience. And there'll be a couple other people who will pop in and make their voices known as well. I've also prepared quite a bit of material to look at and understand what's going on with the conversation, including a running list of the different and varied explanations that BlueMarbleScience offers in regards to this problem with Coriolis. If you're unfamiliar with the discussion at all, I suggest you go back and watch my original video, 3 Questions for Ballers. I'll link that in the description, and there should be the tag that comes up in this video. Watch that so you can get your mind wrapped around what we're talking about. And then if you want to go further and have a further understanding of it, go back and watch the video called George's Coriolis Love Bug. And that'll get you up to speed. But this is going to contain quite a bit of information, and I'm going to go through a lot of clips. And it might be broken into more than one video, but there is some interesting stuff here to give us a further understanding of what this argument about Coriolis is all about. So let's go ahead and get into it.
How long does it take to get there?
The engines.
So we have our first answer as to how the plane gains the speed and momentum and overcomes Coriolis as it heads south, and that is the engines. So now we're talking about thrust or engine power is how the plane overcomes Coriolis. Let's hear what else Blue has to say about that. So that's reason number 1.
The Earth, the plane doesn't know how fast the Earth is rotating, Chris. It only knows the air it's flying in.
Maximum speed is given relative to the air, the atmosphere, which is rotating with the Earth. So, you know, this nonsense about taking the rotational speed of the Earth in, the relative speed of the atmosphere to the Earth is 0. So
we won't spend too much time talking about what Bob is saying in here because he's going to be the subject of a future video. But what he's essentially putting forth is the lockstep atmosphere theory, in which the plane flies through the atmosphere is in lockstep, and there really is no deviation possible in his model. So let's just go ahead and look at our Coriolis slide just to get a refresher for what it is that's going on within Coriolis. And what you're seeing on screen right now is just a partial list of the explanations that we're going to see from Blue in this video. All right, so here is a slide that describes Coriolis and what the different things that we're going to be talking about is. It's really good to get your mind wrapped around these terms because they're going to be thrown at you and they're going to be used in ways that will definitely confuse you if you don't understand what they're talking about. So the first thing that we want to look at is the inertial frame of reference and the non-inertial frame of reference. Those are two things that are going to continue to come up. This is essentially 2 ways of looking at the same object and motion taking place from 2 different points of view, in other words. That's essentially what a reference frame is. So let me just play this thing on the left, which is taken straight from the Wikipedia and is the classic example of Coriolis. This is a ball. It's on a rotating disc, and the ball is going to move outward. So let's just take a look at it. So you can see in this top example, the ball starts off, it moves here in what would be a south direction. We'll just say that's south. The ball goes straight, and the dot, or the spot where the ball was aimed at, moves about a 1/4 turn. So in this case, we're looking from the outside in, from a non-rotating frame of reference down at an object that's rotating with an object moving above it, above the rotating reference frame. So this is equivalent to looking down at the Earth from space. And if you see this example on the right, you can see here's the Earth. The Earth rotates in this counterclockwise fashion. We're looking down from above. And our plane in our example is taking off from Anchorage, Alaska. Now this view shows where Anchorage is after the Earth rotates. So it shows the entire plane flight, each leg of it, and it's got 5 dots, so it's got 5 waypoints essentially. The start, 3 along the way, and 1 at the end. And these are actual data points taken from an actual flight. That is the actual path that it took, looking down at from the inertial frame of reference onto the rotating Earth. So looking down from space. A Coriolis would tell us that if the plane were to travel in a straight vector and never change its heading, basically just put the thruster down, the foot on the gas, and fly, that it would end up here somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. So it would go straight, the Earth would rotate underneath it, just as in this view of from the inertial frame of reference, the ball goes straight and the dot rotates away. So think of the dot as Mexico City, the starting point as Anchorage, Alaska, and the ball is the plane. Okay, so this is with no corrections, the green dotted line. And this red solid line is with corrections. It is the actual path that the flight took to make it to Mexico City as the Earth rotated. Mexico City moved from up here at the starting point down here to the ending point. Pretty simple. Now, from the non-inertial frame of reference, which is down below, this is from a point of view on the actual disk. So if I were standing here at the disk, let's say at the red dot, and I was looking at the ball starts off and I would see it curve away from my vantage point. What's happening in reality, as we can see up here, looking down in the inertial frame of reference, is I'm moving away, I'm rotating with the disk. The ball is going straight, but from my vantage point on the disk, the ball appears to curve away from me. Pretty simple. So this is the rotating view. It's a view from inside, and it's equivalent to the view on the Earth. As you can see on the right, if we're talking about this same plane flight up top, if let's say I could see well enough and tall enough to watch this plane as it came from Anchorage, Alaska. If it made no corrections, I would see it start off towards me, curve away, and end somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. If I'm going by the actual path that the plane took, I would see it come straight towards me. So this is all just a matter of points of view, where we're looking at the plane flight from. Now, in reality, we know what's happening. Just as this view shows, the plane is flying straight, and the disk is rotating underneath, and the plane misses the red dot because of that. Pretty simple. All right, back to the video.
So the plane's speed is the plane's speed.
700 miles per hour over 10 hours is 70 miles per hour. That's about 1 mile per hour per minute. Change.
So Blue here is saying that it's such a minor change over the time frame, with the implications being that it's not really worth thinking about. But if we look back at our presentation, we know that if the plane didn't correct and it flew in a straight line, there would be a huge deviation. So this is not an explanation for what we see. This is just a minimization of the actual problem that we're discussing. So that is reason number 2. The change in speed is minor. Here he says 1 mile per hour per minute. And let's continue and hear what he has to say.
Change.
And what for? Okay, and that's my question. What force is causing that?
The engines.
You just
can't be the engines. It can't.
Chris,
the engines can't keep up with 1,000 mile per hour tangent.
It's a change of 1 mile per hour per minute.
What causes that change?
The engines.
The plane.
The engines are at max power. What are you talking about,
Chris? It's
Blue and Chris.
Blue. Most ballers answer the question by saying that the atmosphere is the force that pushes the plane along. Do you disagree with that?
The atmosphere is the force that pushes. No, the engines are the force that pushes the plane along, Chris.
The engines don't have.
So Blue is very emphatic about the fact that it is the engines that are correcting the plane on its path. So let's take a look at what that would mean. here is our, let's look at this one here. Here is our same flight. So up here, the yellow plane is in Anchorage, Alaska. The white dot is Mexico City. This is not to scale. It's not an exact representation, but it gives us a good enough view of what's going on to understand how changes in speed and heading would impact where the plane would land. So in this diagram, if the plane went straight, the target destination, Mexico City, would move roughly 6,755 miles to the right. If the plane conserved its 513 miles per hour in momentum and just flew straight, it would follow this line here, about 43.7 degrees, and that would take it to 33,591 miles to the east of where Mexico City started. So it would essentially fall short, well short of the 6755, meaning that there is some correction in heading and velocity that is required in order for the plane to make it to its destination of Mexico City, down here 6,755 miles to the east of its original starting position. And you can see the different lengths of these angles, or these hypotenuse here. This one would be 5,195 miles. That's the range. If they, use the same engine speed, the same power as is taken for a straight line course, they would essentially land within this yellow area. Okay, so you can think of this as the limit without any power, engine power change. If they change their heading, but don't increase their engine, this is also as far as they can go. So without changing their power, they will fall well short of their destination at 6,755 miles. We know from tracking the actual flight along its waypoints that the plane had to increase momentum somehow in order to make it to its destination. So keep that in mind. During this whole flight, the Earth rotated 103.5 degrees over the 7 hours, and we have data points that track the plane at these locations as the Earth rotated. So now these weren't over the Pacific Ocean, just keep that in mind. This is just showing the end position of the Earth when the plane arrives at Mexico City. All right, let's go back to the video.
Have enough power to catch up with 1,000-mile-per-hour tangential speed at the equator. We've already talked about that.
You're completely misunderstanding the question you're trying to ask.
I got it.
The plane has to change. Okay, he's not understanding that effectively what you need to do is steer to the east, turn to the.
All right, so here we have our third reason that Blue gives, which is steering, essentially a heading change. So let's take a look at this angle, heading, flight path change. As we looked on our diagram, that is indeed required in order to meet the destination and overcome the Coriolis. So now he said heading, or he said engine and heading.
To the left, if you're coming out of Anchorage, Alaska, you're gonna move to the left just a little bit to make up for the change in speed and as you fly across the surface of the Earth. And that
okay, so now you're.
Yeah, no, Chris, let me finish. And that change in speed is 1 mile per hour per minute.
All right, and here's another minimization of the amount of correction required. 1 mile per hour per minute. That adds up over the course of 7 hours, which is about, 420 minutes? I think the actual difference in the angular velocity across that flight is somewhere around, well, let's take a look at the actual one, and I'll tell you. It's 513 to 979, so it's 466 miles an hour. So close enough. So what Blue's saying is, along this trip, it has to increase its angular velocity, its total speed, by roughly 1 mile per hour per minute in order to make it to its destination.
Does that sound like a big number to you, Chris?
The problem with this explanation is it still doesn't tell us how they do it. It has nothing to do with the mechanism involved in correcting for the Coriolis. It just makes the problem sound smaller.
That is such a tiny little angle change. You'd never even notice it.
So your answer is you must change course.
Of course you do.
Okay, great. So it doesn't have to do with there is no force that keeps the plane in lockstep with the Earth. The cause of keeping up with, say, going to the equator is that you must adjust your flight path.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're adjusting the flight path.
Okay, great.
So if there's no force, then there is no engine power increase. Blue seems to be saying two contradictory things. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he's saying both together. That there is a power increase and a heading increase. We should be pretty easy to see from looking at the plane's flight path that there was indeed a heading change. But if we map that heading of that plane out on our from the non-inertial reference frame, all we see is this plane taking the exact heading that we'd expect it to take on a stationary Earth. You would expect if there was a heading change, we would see that this deviated in some way. We don't see that. In other words, there's no evidence that there was a heading change required, especially one of the magnitude required to overcome that Coriolis force in order to make it to Mexico City.
All right. So what I'm now hearing, I don't know what number answer this is to this basic question. I'm now hearing that the atmosphere does not propel along in lockstep these objects in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it does. Oh, yes, it does, Chris.
You said you said you had to turn left going to Mexico to account for the fact that it doesn't, which is
because of Coriolis effect, Chris, and it's a tiny amount.
So this is kind of a difficult thing to understand. So now he's saying that the atmosphere does propel it along, but that there's something called a Coriolis force, which is what requires the heading and engine power adjustments in order for the plane to make it to its destination. You know, as we know from these diagrams, Coriolis is a result of the object flying the ball, moving in a straight line, while the rotating object is moving underneath it. And then from the point of view of standing on the rotating object, that makes it appear as if the object is curving away from the observer. But in reality, the object is going in a straight line. So what he's describing is correcting for this the fact that the ball is moving in a straight line so that as the ball moves forward, it can meet the red dot, which is exactly what we have mapped out in here from the point of view of the inertial reference frame. If you're looking at it from the non-inertial reference frame and you're trying to correct so that the plane doesn't curve away and go over into the Pacific, I'm guessing that's what he's referring to as the Coriolis force and overcoming it. But this is just, from the point of view of the person on the Earth. The plane has to correct for what they're perceiving as a force that's taking the plane off track. But in reality, the plane is flying straight. So this gets very confusing when you start bringing these reference frames into it. And you'll hear quite a bit of that confusion throughout this discussion. But we'll come back to these diagrams so we can try to keep our head straight about exactly what's going on. Regardless of what frame of reference you're looking at this for, just remember, the same thing is happening. The reference frames have nothing to do with what is actually taking place, which is that the ball is traveling straight, or the plane is traveling straight, and the Earth is rotating beneath it, so that from the vantage point of the non-inertial reference frame, it appears as if the object or the plane is curving away. And in order to make it to the destination, the plane must correct its heading and gain momentum in this example where it's going from north to south. All right, let's keep going with the video.
Now we're back to the atmosphere. Does keep it in lockstep then?
Yes, of course it does. The atmosphere rotates in lockstep with the Earth. Correct.
So here's the problem. If the Earth rotates in lockstep, the plane is within the atmosphere, and that's in lockstep as well, then there wouldn't be any Coriolis. You're essentially talking about when this ball moves, it would be carried along by the atmosphere and just automatically land where the red dot is. So it would be picking up this angular velocity and moving towards the red dot. That says, when you say that there is no Coriolis force. This is Coriolis. This ball moving and being in lockstep with the angular velocity of the object beneath it, the rotating frame, and meeting its destination, that's not Coriolis. That would be non-Coriolis.
Where does the extra speed come from to catch up with the equator, flying north to south?
It's coming from the atmosphere, basically, Chris.
Oh,
earlier the extra speed was coming from the engines. Now it's coming from the atmosphere.
Oh, now, guys, this is great. Brandon Toy is gonna clip this all out and post it. But basically, first it was you had to turn left.
Hold on. Let me rephrase.
Chris, you have a Coriolis effect that's applied to an airplane, just like it is applied to anything that's moving in a rotating frame of reference. Do you understand how to calculate Coriolis force?
Now we're going to get into the old tactic of bringing up a math problem for your debate opponent to solve. And if they can't solve it on the spot, then it's seen as some kind of victory.
That force is 2 mv omega sine alpha.
I'm gonna cut
being
this out.
the
It's not that important.
That's what it is. Do you know what that amounts to on a 100,000 kilogram airplane, Chris? Traveling at 500 miles an hour, a 100,000 kilogram airplane has a Newton force of about 1,800 newtons, Chris. I'm not sidestepping it. I'm explaining something.
You are
183 pounds of Coriolis force acting on an aircraft that weighs 100,000 kilograms. It's nothing.
Whatever he's describing, this Coriolis equation, and I haven't looked into it that much because it isn't that important to the discussion. What he's describing is this. Don't forget this. If he's describing something else as a Coriolis force that isn't this, then it is immaterial to the discussion.
How much force does it take, Chris? It can't accelerate the airplane faster than it is going. That's what we say. That's what we're saying. It's in the atmosphere is in lockstep, and the plane is in lockstep with the atmosphere in that direction. The plane can't be going faster than the atmosphere itself is going. So here's the problem, Chris.
I'm not exactly sure what Blue's point was there, that the plane can't be going faster than what the atmosphere is going. He's essentially carrying out the lockstep atmosphere theory. But in order for the Coriolis force to impact the plane, at some point the plane cannot be going as fast as the atmosphere, which would suggest that it's not in lockstep. So I don't know if that's what he's describing as the Coriolis force, is some deficit of the atmosphere lockstep, or something completely different. Be very interested to know what force he's describing, because it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Creating and confusing himself and everybody else in the process. If the airplane that you're talking about, Chris, is sitting on the ground in Anchorage, Alaska, according to you, it's moving at 300 miles an hour because the Earth is rotating at 300 miles an hour. But the atmosphere is in lockstep with the Earth. And assuming that, how much force is on the side of the plane at that point?
What is the force from that he's talking about? So if the plane is moving in lockstep with the atmosphere is moving in lockstep as the Earth. They're all going the same angular velocity, no matter where you are, which is the same explanation that Bob gives, what is this force that he's talking about that would be acting upon the airplane? It's not Coriolis because everything is in lockstep.
And the answer should be zero, Chris. There is no force if the plane and the air are moving at the same speed. There's no force on the side of the airplane.
Now he's saying that there's no force.
Correct. Do you agree with that?
I'm not following. Do you know what parasite drag is?
I know what parasitic drag is. If you'd like to understand parasitic drag, we can talk about parasitic drag.
What is parasitic drag?
Parasitic drag on an aircraft, Chris, is the drag that's created by all kinds of crap that's hanging off the aircraft, like pitot tubes and stuff like that. Yep. That's what parasitic drag is, Chris.
Okay, so I'm going to read you the definition of parasitic drag.
Maybe you don't want to play that game with a flight instructor, son.
Is drag?
Now he pulls his flight instructor card, reminds the audience that he is an authority and an expert in the subject, and he's talking to a non-authority. Again, obfuscating and throwing a red herring from the actual discussion, taking the focus away from how exactly the airplane makes it to its destination, which is the key question.
Drag of force?
Is drag a force? Yes, it is. Of course.
Is there drag on the airplane in your example?
Of course, there's drag on the airplane.
So then there's force on the airplane.
Going in the other direction, not sideways.
But
so he's saying that the airplane's moving in lockstep with the atmosphere. There's no drag on the side of the plane from the atmosphere pulling or pushing the plane along as it moves, increasing the plane's angular velocity and its momentum.
But isn't the atmosphere pushing against the plane sideways?
Not if it's moving at the same speed as the airplane is moving sideways.
How is the atmosphere pushing the plane? Isn't it friction? Isn't it friction? Isn't friction a force?
How could that be, Chris?
Isn't friction a force?
If the aircraft and the wind are moving at the same speed, how can there be a force? There can't be a force. There is no velocity. There's no velocity difference. It's the same.
Blue is saying that there is never a velocity difference between the atmosphere and the plane. So they're always in lockstep as the plane goes south. But we've got the problem that the plane has to increase its angular velocity and momentum.
Blue, your argument only makes sense if the plane's standing still in the same latitude. If it's flying, let's say it leaves the ground at 300 mile per hour ground speed, and the atmosphere is magically at 300 mile per hour speed as well, perfectly lockstep. Once you go to a different latitude, the increase in the air, the increase in atmospheric speed is going to hit against the plane. That's your whole argument for how the plane moves in lockstep in the first place.
Until it reaches lockstep, Chris.
Until it reaches lockstep, isn't it always in lockstep?
Yeah, it's always in lockstep, and when it comes in, but any change in that results in a force that pushes it.
It needs exactly more force. You just said it, and that's the atmosphere pushing against it.
Hi, Blue.
So here we have a situation that Blue's described. He's directly contradicting himself within a very short period of time. So his contention is that this lockstep atmosphere carries the plane automatically along the red line, that there's no corrections or engine power required in order for it to make its destination, which contradicts his earlier description of engines and heading change be required to overcome Coriolis. Now he's saying that the mechanism by which the plane is carried and by which its angular velocity and momentum is increased is the atmosphere pushing on the side of the plane. But that only happens when there's a deficit, meaning the plane isn't going as fast as the angular velocity of the atmosphere. But that angular velocity is always changing as it goes south. So there must always be some kind of force pushing on the side of the plane, creating a force that pushes the airplane to its destination. Now, Chris brought up parasitic drag, meaning not all of that force is going to be transferred from the atmosphere to the airplane. It's not going to be one-to-one. This is something that we discussed in previous videos. It would be different at different altitudes, say at 5,000 feet above sea level versus 30,000 feet. the atmosphere at 30,000 feet is a lot thinner than the atmosphere at 5,000 feet. So there's going to be less force as the plane flies south, pushing at 30,000 feet than there is at 5,000 feet. And the question that was brought up previously was, how does the pilot correct for that difference in atmosphere if that atmosphere is keeping the plane in lockstep?
First of all, I'd like to say, love your show, and your work on the Cavendish stuff is amazing. Great woodwork.
WS is going to jump in with a alternative theory.
With regards to the plane and things like that, I've put it in the side chat actually, but I like to think of it in terms of engine power, but I could be wrong, so please tell me. If I was traveling east to west, for example, so obviously the Coriolis effect with regards to the speed of the rotation of the Earth, it has no effect. If I want to travel at, say, 300 miles an hour, I'll put the engines at 60% power and I'll go at 300 miles per hour. When you were talking about the little packet steps of going from 300 to 301 and 301 to 302, is that not just, say, going at 61% power or 62% power? Because as soon as you've made that step from 301 miles, 300 miles per hour to 301, you're already there. Your engine can go back to 60% power to maintain 301.
That's the point I was trying to make. Yeah, that's exactly the point I was trying to make.
So as you if you visualize this, let's go back to the presentation and look at this little chart. So as the plane flies south, the atmosphere pushes it, but it doesn't transfer all of the momentum. So the plane has to increase its engine power in order to get into the right position above the ground to follow its ground track. What WS is contending is that the plane will throttle up, it'll get to the correct angular velocity, it'll get to the correct position or the correct speed so that it's moving with the same angular speed as the ground, and then it'll throttle back its engine, and then when it falls back again, it'll throttle back up its engine, and then it'll let the throttle down again as it gets to that angular velocity at that level. That kind of ignores the fact that the plane is constantly going to be moving into higher angular velocity area. In order to make it to this destination, there has to be a continuous change in the heading and continuous power increases. It has to have both, or it will never make it here.
Yes, that's
lockstep is lockstep. Once everything's in equilibrium, there's no more force being applied to anything.
Exactly.
We just went over the fact that when there's a deficit, then there is a force. And then when the force gets it back to lockstep, then there isn't a force. But if it's flying south, that cycle is just going to happen over and over again.
So where Chris was getting it wrong, he seems to think that the plane's got to be able to travel at 1,000 miles an hour to achieve that 1,000 miles an hour. It hasn't. It's just got to achieve the acceleration needed to maintain the lockstep. I suppose if we go back to that example with Blue, so if I was traveling north to south.
Now think about this. If I have to increase my engines to 61% power in order to catch up and keep up with the Earth, why would I then be able to throttle down and just be going at that increased speed? There needs to be some kind of force that's going to maintain the momentum that I have at that new position after I've throttled up.
So obviously the Coriolis, or the rotational speed of the Earth is increasing. I have to use 61% power to maintain that 300 miles per hour. But if I was going from the equator to the North Pole, I could go at 59% power or 58% power to maintain that 300 miles per hour speed.
I think this is just another clever way to minimize the issue by making it sound like there's only a 1 mile per hour or 1% engine difference that is intermittently required in order to make these adjustments.
There will be a slight correction going on due to Coriolis.
Now, again, he says that there will be a slight correction going on due to Coriolis.
Coriolis force is always going to deflect you to the right in the northern hemisphere.
And when he says it's always going to deflect you to the right, that's what we're talking here. The deflection he's talking about is the straight line path that the object takes. So on our other chart here, the straight line path that the object takes is straight down. That's a deflection to the right. From our point of view in the non-inertial reference frame, it's deflecting to the right on the green path. And if we were watching it from Mexico City, we would see it veer off to the right from the plane's point of view.
And that force is 2mv omega sine alpha. That's that computes to an actual force if you take a 100,000 kilogram airplane.
Now he's going to bring up another calculation, just another bit of obfuscation with mathematics that they love to do.
Traveling at 500 miles an hour, that force is 1,800 newtons. Yeah. Yeah, he acts like you can't bank the plane 1/10 of a degree.
The real force required to follow that path to keep you on your track to Mexico City, this plane has to literally be, pushed increasingly more in order to make it to Mexico City. You're moving this mass, the plane, which is naturally going to travel in this direction, somehow along this path instead. And this is increasing speed. It's a farther distance in the same amount of time. So just like we talked about here, in order to close this gap, it requires force, period. And it's the force required to move that plane from its 513 miles per hour to a steady 979 miles per hour in angular velocity over the 7 hours. All of these equations and, talking about it in different units is just more obfuscation by trying to make the problem sound very minimal. It is not a minimal problem, and it is something that pilots should have to deal with every single flight, north to south or south to north.
It's inconsequential. No,
it's inconsequential. Let's check in on our different reasons that we've gotten from Blue so far before we continue. We had the engines. We had the change in speed is minor, 1 mile per hour per minute. Angle, heading, flight path change is required. Lockstep atmosphere. Coriolis force is tiny, weak, only 183 pounds force. Last time I checked, it doesn't take only 183 pounds of force to move a entire plane through the atmosphere like that sideways. Does that sound right to you? The plane cannot be going faster than the atmosphere is going. I'm a flight instructor. There is no force because it is in lockstep with the atmosphere, but there is until it reaches lockstep, but it is in lockstep, but when it changes, then there is a force. Intermittent acceleration and deceleration.